Much, Steve. It's a delight to be with you this morning. We're going to use this handout as a basis of our discussion and move through it at points rather rapidly, but this will provide us to use one of the book of Proverbs' root metaphors with a map, a path, as it were, a way through these 2 hours that we'll be spending together. Just to begin, just to sort of whet our appetites here concerning the book of Proverbs, I put that quote at the top of the handout by G. Ernst Wright, writing here in the 1950s, where he says, "The difficulty of the wisdom movement was that its theological base and interests were too narrowly fixed. And in this respect, Proverbs remains near the pagan source of wisdom, in which society and the divine work in history played no real role." What is going on here? Pagan source of wisdom? Well, I think Wright captures something of our lack of interest in the book of Proverbs. It doesn't play by the rules of a redemptive historical approach to biblical theology. It doesn't mention those formative events within Israel's history. It doesn't explicitly mention the covenants. So it's very difficult to position Proverbs within the sweep of redemptive history and get a sense of how it is contributing to God's salvific program. It's pagan, Wright says. Or if we draw from some recent works in the late 90s from some German scholars writing in journals on pastoral theology, don't preach Proverbs in the church. It's no good. We've missed something. What we've missed is Proverbs' contribution to life, to the church, doesn't consist of salvation history. That is to say, playing some sort of historical role within salvation history. Rather, its contribution lies in the way in which it outlines the nature and the shape and the substance of a wise and godly life. So with that point of orientation, by way of introduction, let me just say something about the unusual nature of the book of Proverbs. It is a book that is both familiar and unusual, unfamiliar. It's familiar with respect to the parts. I mean, even in light of contemporary discourse today, sound bites, our own use of Proverbs, the parts of the book are familiar. And among the parts, some of the sayings in the book have become melodies within the church community's life, such as, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Or Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your path straight." Or Proverbs 22, verse 5, "Train up a child in the way that he or she should go, and in the end, he or she will not depart from it." Common tunes. We're familiar with the parts. But when we step back and look at the book of Proverbs as a whole, it is unusual. There's nothing else like it in the canon of Scripture. And the unusual nature of the whole raises all sorts of questions. Questions like, how do we read the book of Proverbs as a whole? How do all of the different sorts of materials in the book function? What are Proverbs? Are they promises? Are they prophecies? Or are they simply general principles? And what do we make of the morass of sayings in the middle of the book? Is it just a graveyard of dead proverbs that need to be plucked up and applied into specific circumstances in order to live? Or are those sayings within the center of the book carefully placed, configured in such a way that they contribute to the design and the function of the whole? These are some of the questions that I hope we can not only address, but feel like we understand in terms of the answers to them in our time this morning into this afternoon. But before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty and the specifics, let's get our bearings as it concerns the purpose of the book of Proverbs. What is the purpose of the book of Proverbs? The Oak Hill alums will realize I don't really ask rhetorical questions, and so I want some give and take here, if that's okay. What is the purpose of Proverbs? Wisdom. What is wisdom according to Proverbs?
Living to please God.
Okay, living to please God. So wisdom in that respect is not narrowly defined. It's not just about the intellect. It encompasses the entirety of one's being. One's intellect, yes, but one's character, one's desires, one's worldview, one's movements. Wisdom is all-encompassing in that respect. And if we use Proverbs 1, verses 1 to 7, our sort of entry into the book, as a guide to the purpose of Proverbs, then we might say that the book seeks to form or transform our characters in accord with divine wisdom and divine virtue. Or put differently, we might say the book of Proverbs seeks to form God-fearers. This is not a book for fools. It's not a book for the wicked. It's not a book for sluggards. Those individuals, according to Proverbs, cannot learn. They're beyond the pale. It's not for them. It's a book for God-fearers. A book that seeks to form and transform God-fearers. We might say it in these terms. The book of Proverbs is concerned with discipleship, sanctification, conforming our character, our mind, our desires, our feelings, our worldview in accord with divine wisdom and virtue. That's just a sort of distillation of what the book of Proverbs is about, what it's attempting to do. With that in mind, let me just say a word about point C on the handout. What in the world are we reading here? What in the world are we reading? I mean, if the nature of a book or a text orients you to the sorts of rules that you would apply to read it and interpret it, when we come to Proverbs, the question becomes, what am I reading here and how do I go about reading it? We could, along the lines of letter A there, orienting ourselves to the genre of Proverbs, just simply say, well, we have just a collection of Proverbs here, which in many respects is true. The book is a collection of collections. But collection of Proverbs isn't very helpful when it comes down to how do I go about reading this book? If nothing else, it fails to capture the diverse materials in the book. More than simply individual proverbs. There's longer instructions like we have in Proverbs 1 to 9. There are longer admonitions like we have, or exhortations like we have in chapters 22 to 24. So collection of Proverbs really doesn't do it for us. And the same is true of the designation wisdom literature. Wisdom literature, a term like that, might orient us to the sort of mode of discourse or mode of thought or sorts of emphases that we find in a book like Proverbs. But it doesn't help us in terms of how do I actually go about reading it. Proverbs is something of a riddle in terms of genre, in terms of its literary form. It's an anomaly in the canon of Scripture. There's nothing else like it. But if we step back and view Proverbs in the ancient context out of which it was written, we find all sorts of texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia that are comparable to the book. Texts that help us understand not only the nature of Proverbs, but also the function of the book. They orient us to how do I go about reading Proverbs, and how might I think about the way in which this book functions as a whole, as a coherent book? And so, as we look at these ancient Near Eastern texts, we see that, like Proverbs, we have a conventional discourse or dialogical setting. That is to say, the vast majority of these texts are all written as advice from a father to a son. That is the context or the dialogical setting that we find in all these other texts. We also find a common style. These texts are didactic. They're trying to teach something in particular, cultural values. But more than that, these documents contain a variety of different literary forms. Extended admonition, short proverbs, longer instructions. And it's that sort of variety that we also see in the book of Proverbs. So even in terms of style, there's a sort of diversity of different literary forms in these texts, comparable to Proverbs. We have common content and subject matter. Here, Proverbs is addressing issues, like these other texts, that are relevant to all people. Speech ethics, business ethics, matters of social justice, just to name a few. There's common content, there's common subject matter, indicating that Proverbs is engaged in an international conversation about what is the good life. What is the good life? What is good? Proverbs enters that international conversation, providing its own perspective. And it's these sorts of similarities in setting and style and subject matter that orient us to how Proverbs functions in a way similar to these ancient texts, but also quite distinct. Similar to these ancient texts, Proverbs is concerned with what we might call education and enculturation. Or to use different terms, these ancient texts, like the book of Proverbs, are seeking to socialize us or catechize us, as it were. Train us through instruction in certain cultural, theological, ethical values. Form us, catechize us, shape us through that education. But the key distinction is found in letter B, or point 2 there. Formation of character and virtue versus utilitarianism. These other ancient Near Eastern texts, they're concerned with social success, self-help literature. How do I succeed in life? There's quite a market for those sorts of works in our own context. That is not Proverbs' concern. It's not some brand of ancient self-help literature. It's not concerned with practical strategies for coping with life. It's concerned with character, the formation of character, the cultivation of virtue. So these texts help us understand what we're reading and how the book of Proverbs functions. With that, any questions around just Proverbs as a whole and these sorts of texts that orient us to what in the world we're in fact reading and how we might understand how Proverbs functions? Yes?
You might come to this later, but you talk about a collection of collections.
Yes.
Are you going to talk a little bit about how it all came together, or could you just give us...
How they hang together?
No, how the book might have come together, and are we saying that there's different collections from different authors and things like that?
Yes, there certainly are. And I think here, well, we're going to move now into the structure of the book. I'm going to treat the structure of the book in such a way where I'm integrating certain collections that are in fact separate. So if we only look at the titles within the book alone, 1:1, Proverbs of Solomon, which seems to indicate that the materials in the book as a whole were either collected by Solomon, or all of the materials in the book reflect, as it were, Solomonic wisdom. They align with, as it were, Solomon's wisdom. Because when we come to chapter 10, verse 1, we get another title as we enter the central collections of the book. These are the Proverbs of Solomon. But then when we come to chapter 22, verse 17, Pay attention and turn your ear to the sayings of the wise. We now get these words of the wise. And then in chapter 24, verse 23, these also are sayings of the wise, a sort of appendix to the words of the wise, also written by the wise. Before we come to chapter 25, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah collected or transcribed. To then chapter 30, Agur, this foreigner, who's not mentioned, as far as I know, anywhere else in the ancient world. To then chapter 31, Lemuel's mother, instructing her son, another foreigner. So there's several different collections within the book. And yet, as I'll argue here, it seems that they have been deliberately collated or arranged, crafted as it were, to contribute to the book's theological, ethical, and pedagogical agenda. Does that make sense? With that, let's move to the structure of Proverbs. Here is where I want to spend most of our time, sort of filling in the gaps as it concerns the sort of movement of the book, its substance, and how it all hangs together. So, as I've mentioned, while Proverbs, really in light of the collections, could be divided into 7 distinct sections, I want to treat it in 4. And the first is the preamble in chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. Let me just read it for us so it's fresh in our mind. Proverbs 1, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Here's our entryway into the book. And we might think of Proverbs 1, verses 1 to 7 as a sort of course syllabus. It's a course syllabus. It outlines, especially in verses 2 to 4, what we might call the threshold learning outcomes of Proverbs. Its aim, its agenda, what it's trying to do. And here we learn that the book is seeking to instill within us all sorts of different virtues. I mean, contrary to what many have thought, this list of virtues in verses 2 to 4 are not just a piling up of synonyms for wisdom. A piling up of terms to just sort of overload us with the fact that this book is trying to teach us wisdom. No. These distinct terms show us the different sorts of virtues the book seeks to instill within us. Intellectual virtues, wisdom, and instruction. To instrumental, practical virtues. Verse 3a, prudent behavior. To moral, communal virtues, righteousness, justice, equity. To instrumental virtues again. Verse 4a, prudence, shrewdness. To intellectual virtues again. Verse 4b, knowledge and discretion. It's holistic. The intellect, prudent behavior, one's manner of life, righteousness, justice, equity, moral virtues, all spelled out in an intricate design, indicating, as we've already mentioned, wisdom is much more than the intellect, according to Proverbs. It is holistic. It encompasses one's entire being, one's manner of life. In addition to sketching the sort of threshold learning outcomes, or what the book is attempting to achieve, the preamble also identifies the addressees of the book, plural. We saw them in verses 4 and 5. You have here in my NIV 2011, for giving prudence to those who are simple. They're young, they're simple. And in verse 5, the wise. There are dual addressees here. The wise, by definition, according to Proverbs, is not only one who listens, is a listener, but one who can always grow in wisdom. The wise knows that they're not always that wise, and they can always grow in wisdom. The book is for them. It's interesting, in Proverbs, sort of the ideal character, the prototype, as it were, is not the wise, but it's the righteous. Because the wise can always grow in wisdom, but the righteous don't grow in righteousness. They're just righteous. Let the wise here grow in wisdom, but the primary addressee seems to be this simpleton, or what we might consider an uncommitted youth. The simple is neither wise nor foolish, neither righteous nor wicked. They're what we might call undecided. They haven't committed to one or the other. And in large part, what Proverbs 1-9 is seeking to do is to convince this uncommitted youth to choose wisdom, to get wisdom. Two primary addressees, the uncommitted being the one who the book seeks to transform. The wise is one who can always grow in wisdom. To then, finally, the prerequisite for achieving the purpose of the book, for growing in these virtues and values the book seeks to instill in us, which is that well-known expression, that concept, the fear of the Lord. What does that mean? What? Okay, it produces reverence. Healthy respect.
Acknowledgement of who he is.
Okay, so it is the fear of the Lord. It assumes, by definition, relationship with the Lord, a knowledge of the Lord's will. It assumes that knowledge, that relationship. The fear of the Lord is a multifaceted attitude. It's an attitude developed in relationship with God through a knowledge of God's will. It is an attitude that, according to wisdom in chapter 8, that hates what is evil and loves what is good. So it includes our emotions, a hatred for what is evil, a love for what is good. It's an attitude that represents the beginning, the first principle of wisdom. For it's an attitude that recognizes dependence on God in order to not only receive wisdom, Proverbs 2, God is the one who grants wisdom in the first place, but also to grow in wisdom. We're utterly dependent. We're recognizing right off the bat that we are limited, finite creatures who live in utter dependence and relationship with a transcendent God. And that cultivates a whole worldview, a whole mode of being that is encapsulated by the fear of the Lord. The reason why fools cannot learn, hate wisdom and knowledge, is not because they don't have enough information. It's they don't have the right perspective. The fear of the Lord captures something of perspectival knowledge, where what we know, facts, propositions, We view from a particular perspective. The fear of the Lord is identifying the sort of posture, perspective, and relationship that is required, not only in order to receive wisdom, but also to grow in wisdom. And it is that attitude then that produces its reverence, its humility. It's a recognition of limits in relationship with God. Some of those dimensions of the fear of the Lord that become the very prerequisite for the acquisition of wisdom and growth in wisdom that we find in the book of Proverbs. There's the preamble. It's our entryway into the book that really captures and distills what the book of Proverbs is trying to do, what its very purpose is. It's right on the tin here. Questions around the preamble here. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, before we move along. Ollie.
Chris, the thing that struck me that folk might not be familiar with is this idea of the Proverbs being addressed to the uncommitted person. Do we see that addressed again?
Yes, so what we find, and we'll come on to this as we discuss sort of the dialogical and discourse setting of Proverbs, what we find is the simple or the uncommitted mentioned in chapter 1, verse 4. Now, when we come then to the speeches in Proverbs 1 to 9, the sort of parental speeches, father, mother, are addressed to son. But wisdom's speeches at the front end, among other character types who are addressed, for example, in chapter 1, wisdom in verse 20 and 22 not only addresses mockers and fools, but the first one she mentions are the simple. So wisdom addresses the simple. The parents address the son. They're not different addressees. We are to recognize that they're one and the same. So in Proverbs 8, for example, wisdom begins by addressing the simple, the uncommitted, among other character types. And then at the end of her speech addresses sons. They don't seem to be mutually exclusive. And what the book does is it's inviting us as readers here, right off the bat in Proverbs 1, 1 to 7, to assume the position, as it were. Are you wise? Do you fear Yahweh? Do you fear the Lord? If so, continue on so that you might grow in wisdom. Or are you uncommitted? Do you need to assume the position of someone who has not made a decision here and allow these materials to roll over you and move you to choose wisdom, to enter her house, to sit at her table, and to dine on her fare? That's what's going on through Proverbs 1 to 9. Not mutually exclusive. Let's then move to what we'll call here the prologue, from chapter 1, verse 8 to the end of chapter 9, verse 18, where we have all these extended speeches by the parents, by wisdom, by folly. These materials, on the whole, function in a very important way within the book of Proverbs as a whole. Let me just identify two different ways in which Proverbs 1 to 9 functions in the context of the whole. First, Proverbs 1 to 9 serves as a formal introduction to Proverbs 10 to 29, all those individual sayings in the middle of the book. How does it go about doing that? How does it introduce us and prepare us for the materials in the middle of the book? Well, one of the ways in which it does it is through this discourse or dialogical setting. We mentioned it with respect to those ancient Near Eastern texts where you had a father addressing a son in a particular context. That provides the setting through which we are to read and hear everything in the remainder of those texts. The same is true in Proverbs, where Proverbs 1 to 9 establishes, as it were, the setting through which we are to hear and read and understand the materials within the remainder of the book. And that setting is established through the speaker, the addressees, and the setting of the discourse. Who's the speaker in Proverbs 1 to 9? Well, the father, who seems to be, in light of an implied role, back to chapter 1, verse 1, Solomon. Solomon is the speaker, situated, as it were, in the implied role as a father. And while we hear many voices in Proverbs 1 to 9, the sinners in chapter 1, wisdom, the adulterous woman, Lady Folly, it is the father who quotes their speech. He is the voice that dominates chapters 1 to 9. The father dominating the discourse. He is the speaker. The addressee, as we just mentioned with Ollie's question, is in certain lectures a son or sons, in others the simple, among others, not mutually exclusive. What we have here is an uncommitted youth, an adolescent, in light of the content of Proverbs 1 to 9, one who possesses strong sexual appetites, who can engage in adulteress, one who recognizes the value of material wealth. This is an adolescent getting ready to strike out on their own, become an independent adult, and yet is uncommitted. Where does this discourse take place? Father to a young adolescent youth, uncommitted? Well, it seems to take place in the home. While many read the father-son sort of idiom as a cipher for a teacher-pupil relationship, by virtue of the mention of the mother in chapter 1, verse 8, and chapter 6, verse 20, it seems what we have in Proverbs 1 to 9 here is a series of instructions delivered by a father to his son, this uncommitted adolescent, in the context of the home. Now, caveat here, while Proverbs addresses this material to a son, that does not mean that this material is only relevant for young, uncommitted adolescent males. It's a scandal of particularity here. Jesus is a first century Jewish man. It's a scandal of particularity, reflecting the context out of which this speaks. And in the same way that Proverbs uses various images and themes and contextualize them for instructing a young, uncommitted adolescent youth, so also we need to do the work of recontextualizing it for both males and females. For the virtues, the values, the vices that are mentioned here aren't just male virtues and vices. They're relevant for all. And here, if we follow a guy named William Brown, who's in the footnotes at various places, I think what we see here is something of a narrative undercurrent within the book that might help us to see how this sort of setting that I'm babbling on about actually goes to work for us in Proverbs. We have a father instructing a simple son or an uncommitted youth in the context of the home. Throughout the various lectures and instructions in Proverbs 1 to 9, we have the father attempting to move the son to embrace wisdom, to get wisdom at all costs. It culminates in chapter 9. 2 invitations, one from Lady Wisdom, one from Dame Folly. Come to my house. Eat my food. Which will we choose? Proverbs 1 to 9 ends at the crossroads. Unless we choose wisdom, no need to carry on. Unless you've got wisdom, chapter 10 and following is just a waste of your time. But for those who choose wisdom, enter her house, sit at her table, they might enjoy her food that's served up in the middle of the book. As we come to chapter 10, we realize, you know what, there's no more hand-holding here. No more spoon feeding. There's no father or mother there to help us sort out what these proverbs mean and how they might shape our thinking, our manner of life. We're on our own now. And as we move through the center of the book and chew on and digest and grow in this life of wisdom through all of these different sorts of sayings, we then emerge, as it were, from chapter 29 into chapter 30 with Agur saying to us, in the event you've moved through this module, this extended curriculum on wisdom, and you think you've got it, you think you've arrived, think again. Think again. Your wisdom is limited. It is finite. And with that recognition, we come to understand it's not what you know, Agur says, but who you know that really matters. The Lord. And then in chapter 31, we're still in the home now. A mother instructing her son as he's preparing to take the throne. To then the end of chapter 31, where we find the very embodiment of wisdom in everyday life in this woman, married with the husband at the gate. Proverbs, if it has this sort of underlying narrative, moves from the home, where one hopefully chooses wisdom, then grows through the center of the book through this curriculum and comes out the other side recognizing their limits, chapter 30, how to lead, chapter 31, married to the very embodiment of wisdom. It's a growth, a maturation of character that occurs through the book. That's one of the ways in which this discourse setting goes to work for us and helps us understand the context of the whole. But Proverbs 1-9 not only provides us with that discourse setting, but also, there on the handout, it provides an introduction to basic character types and themes. Proverbs 1-9 is introducing wise, fool, righteous, wicked, scoffer, certain themes like the way or path, preparing us for what's to come in chapters 10-29. If all we had was chapters 1-9, we would have a very narrow, simplistic view of the wise life. What would it be? Don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery? Is that what it's all about? No, of course not. Proverbs 1-9 is not trying to provide us with some sort of comprehensive, nuanced vision of the wise life. It's trying to get us to get wisdom. Once we've done that, and are oriented to those major themes, the middle of the book can begin to unpack and develop and fill in a lot of those gaps. So it's introducing us to key themes and key character types that will then be developed in the middle of the book. Two particular ways in which Proverbs 1-9 introduces us and prepares us for 10-29. But Proverbs 1-9 does more than this in the context of the book. It not only introduces us to chapters 10-29, but it exists in intimate relationship with chapters 30 and 31. With chapters 30 and 31, it forms a framework, bookends, within which to read and understand what in the world is going on in chapters 10-29. How does it establish that framework, those bookends? Well, through these terms and concepts and expressions that are unique to these two parts of the book. They're there on your handout. The fear of the Lord, mentioned chapter 1, verse 7, right at the end of the book's preamble, its introduction. It's mentioned again right at the end of the prologue of the introduction, chapter 9, verse 10. Right at the hinge between the two invitations from wisdom and folly. It's right smack toward the middle of the book in chapter 15, verse 33. And of course, it's mentioned right at the end with this valiant woman who is the very exemplar of the fear of the Lord. To knowledge of the Holy One. This expression is only used in chapter 9, verse 10 and by Agur in chapter 30. It's the only time it's used in Proverbs. Linking those texts. Or the maternal voice. You know, the mother is mentioned in chapter 1, verse 8, in chapter 6, verse 20, but we don't hear her. We do in chapter 31, where Lemuel's mother instructs her son. There we see the domestic setting We haven't left it necessarily. That household context of instruction from Proverbs 1 to 9 reemerges in chapter 31 with Lemuel's mother instructing her son. To the female figures, female figures, wisdom, folly, the adulteress, the son's wife, they dominate much of Proverbs 1 to 9. And then we come to chapter 31, mother instructing her son, and this woman who embodies wisdom, female figures, establishing a relationship between the introduction and the conclusion to the book. To there, how Lady Wisdom exists in intimate relationship with the valiant woman of Proverbs 31. Here, you see in this portrait of the valiant woman in Proverbs 31 terms and expressions that are only used elsewhere in Proverbs for Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom, who exists on this sort of metaphorical field in Proverbs 1 to 9, is historicized and embodied in this woman at the end of the book. Both are difficult to obtain. Both are more precious than corals. Both are proprietesses of substantial households. Both are sources of security. Both are exemplars or paragons of the fear of the Lord. And as a result, we begin to see the valiant woman. This woman is the very embodiment of wisdom's character, and as a result, the antitype or opposite of this adulterous woman that we see in Proverbs 1 to 9. So just to sum up the function of Proverbs 1 to 9, it seeks to instill or inculcate receptivity within us. Every single discourse in Proverbs 1 to 9. Listen. Take heed. Don't forget. Keep my words. Every single discourse opens with the same sorts of terms. Right, I got it. Repetition, 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 repetition. It seeks to form a listening posture. Receptivity to wisdom. The introduction illuminates the value of wisdom and virtue. And we'll come on to this and fill this out in much more detail in a moment. The value of wisdom. Why is wisdom valuable? The book is trying to move us to embrace it, to providing us with a framework through which to understand the rest of the book, introducing us to what's to come, to, as we've already mentioned, identifying the prerequisite for entering Proverbs 10 to 29. Unless you've chosen wisdom, you cannot proceed. Some of the ways in which Proverbs 1 to 9 functions in the context of the whole. Questions around Proverbs 1 to 9. How it works within the book. Great. We have the preamble, chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. We have the prologue, chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 9, verse 18. Third, we have these central collections in chapters 10 through 29. Here you see just some of the architecture of those collections. Proverbs of Solomon, there's that title in chapter 10, verse 1 to chapter 22, verse 16. Before then, we enter the words of the wise, both 1 and 2 in chapters 22 to 24, before we come to the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah compiled in chapters 25 to 29. The question is there any rhyme or reason to the way in which these collections have been arranged? Are they marked by chaos or coherence? What do we think? Chaos or coherence? Okay. What do we do with this? This is the point at which, we're doing a preaching series on Proverbs, right? 1 to 9, no problem. Come to chapter 10, uh-oh. What do I do? Let's just do a series on 1 to 9. Chaos or coherence? You see some of the general sentiments here. It's just random, haphazard, no rhyme or reason, chaos. Or no, we have deliberate arrangement, either in pairs, each proverb sort of comes in a pair, as it were, or even we have larger coherent clusters of sayings. to everyone agreeing, at the end of the day, even if you have larger clusters and coherent networks, each individual proverb needs to be read and understood and respected on its own. To the rhetorical significance of both haphazard arrangement and coherence. I mean, there you can make the case for, yeah, there's chaos, and that just reflects the nature of everyday life in the world. To, no, there's coherence and there's order, which again would reflect the manner in which God has created and ordered life. I mean, there's different ways in which we could read the rhetorical significance of both chaos and coherence. What I'd like to do is sort of identify the two basic models or paradigms that are applied to see some measure of coherence within chapters 10 to 29. One at the micro level and one at the macro level. Let's begin with sort of principles of arrangement at the micro level, that is to say, an immediate literary context. Immediate literary context, I mean, as that name suggests, you're looking at the arrangement of individual sayings and how their arrangement might create broader contexts or signs of coherence. The assumption here is that those who arranged these proverbs did so in such a way in order to account for their loss of oral context and use. Without that context, you have a literary context now that helps you to sort out what they mean. If I was simply to say, too many cooks spoil the broth, on its own, without recognizing who am I saying it to and what is the situation that proverb is addressing, it wouldn't make much sense. Same is true of the sayings in the middle of the book. They're divorced from their oral context, their live use. And so the assumption here is because they're divorced from that, and we need some sort of context to sort out what they mean, those who arranged these materials created a context, linked up sayings, so we can sort out what they mean. And we see these signs of coherence really through the criteria of sound and sense. So sound, wordplay, catchwords, repeated terms. An example, if you just look at Proverbs 10, verses 20 and 21. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, but the heart of the wicked is of little value. Verse 21, the lips of the righteous nourish many, but fools die for lack of sense. Righteous mentioned in both, linking the sayings, both concerned with speech, trying to provide a measure of coherence. To that same chapter, verses 24 to 25. What the wicked dread will overtake them. What the righteous desire will be granted. When the storm has swept by, the wicked are gone, but the righteous stand firm. Righteous, wicked, contrast, both sayings set right next to each other, providing a fuller picture of these character types, their fates, measure of coherence at the micro level. To sense, common images, themes, topics. Proverbs 16, 1-9 are all sayings concerned with the Lord. See, they're all grouped together there to provide a unit concerned with God's character. To chapter 16, verses 10 to 15 are all about the king. To Proverbs 26, verses 1 to 12, all about the fool. So you have these sections of sayings, all concerned with a particular character or a particular theme that evince some sign, even if small, of coherence amid chaos. But that's not the only way to look at Proverbs 10 to 29, especially as it concerns the coherence of these materials. At the micro level, in the nitty-gritty, we might see pairs of proverbs, even larger groups of proverbs. But if we step back from the individual sayings and look at the collections as a whole, at the sort of bird's eye level, we also see signs of coherence. And that coherence is apparent through this thematic and pedagogical development within the book. What does that mean? Well, under the summary of the approach, as I've just intimated, it offers that sort of macro or bird's eye perspective, looking at signs of formal, and thematic development that transpires throughout Proverbs 10 to 29. And it's quite striking that in Proverbs 10 to 15, almost every single saying, save 3 or 4, is a contrast, an antithetical saying. Sharp, pretty black and white. People are just sort of sorted out into 2 camps. Wise, fool. Righteous, wicked. Generous, miser. Lazy, diligent. There's no gray area there. Pretty basic. And even that sort of mode of teaching, just simple contrasts. Okay. Pedagogical dependability, I know what's coming next. Right, another contrast, sort out those character types. Then we come to chapter 16, and all of a sudden, we have maybe 3 contrasts. From there to chapter 22, whoa, now the diction is ratcheted up. I'm not in elementary school anymore. With more nuance. Themes, motifs are developed. And the same is true throughout the remainder of the book. We're looking for those signs of development, increasing variety of literary forms. The arrangement of the collections as a result may be viewed in light of our modern educational curricula, moving from sort of the ABCs, elementary wisdom, through intermediate, through vocational, to advanced wisdom. We enter, as it were, this course, this education, moving from the elementary and the ABCs to advanced wisdom. And what is that doing as a result? As we move through the book, as we go on this sort of educational journey, our development in wisdom, our maturation, as it were, should reflect and be mirrored in the maturation and the development of our character. As we progress through the curriculum and grow in wisdom, we're set off on a journey where our character experiences maturation, is honed, cultivated, nurtured, developed. Before we put this approach to work, I might be out of time here. Questions around just the summary of that approach from that basic sketch and how that's seeking to see some measure of coherence within Proverbs 10 to 29, but at the macro level rather than at the nitty-gritty micro level.
Chris, I guess most of us would be familiar with people cherry-picking a proverb here or a proverb there. This approach you've identified to seeing patterns of coherence and so on, are you seeing that kind of grow? Is that a view that is growing in credibility and so on? Is that a view that people are increasingly saying, no, we can see these kind of structural markers and themes and how things link together?
Yeah. It's a yes and no. I mean, some just say, no, there's chaos within the collections. If you want to read the book in that way, you're almost reading it too much as a narrative when it's not a narrative. And I recognize those sorts of criticisms. But I think the proof is in the pudding, and the proof in the pudding is in the eating. And so as a result, when you put this to work, I think it really does work well. And the way in which it cashes out then in preaching is, okay, let's say I come to chapters 10 to 29, and I want to have a go at sort of teaching this section of Proverbs. If you buy into this sort of macro coherence in terms of pedagogical development, what that then means is, even if you're going to take a topical approach to the stuff in chapters 10 to 29, like, okay, I want to do a sermon on sort of speech ethics or wealth and poverty or work or whatever it might be. What that means is, rather than sort of plucking out sayings around those themes and then just sort of forming your own narrative, as it were, with those sayings you plucked out, now you have a trajectory to follow within the book. They're already placed there for you. Even if you just want to focus on those 5 or 6, reflect on them in light of the trajectory of the sweep of this curriculum, as it were, within the book. Don't dislodge them from their place in the curriculum. Read them in that trajectory. Allow them to enter into dialogue with one another along the trajectory in which they've been situated. I think that's how it goes to work for you in that respect.
Do you mean by that, when you look at a theme of the sluggard or whatever it is, that there's developments? You said trajectory.
Yes.
Is there development within a section of these particular themes?
Development in terms of character types, sure, they're nuanced, they're refined, our understanding of them. So the sluggard, only mentioned in Proverbs 1:9 in chapter 6, and then mentioned sort of increasingly as the book moves along. So if we have sort of, I'm going to go after the sluggard and preach on the sluggard, it's okay, let's then see, as I take the sluggard's mentions throughout the book, how that character type, in light of the development in the book, is nuanced, developed. I get different angles on this individual's character. Even when we come down into chapter 26, where it's just outright satirical and silly, the sort of rationale and reasons that this person comes up with in order not to work. That is nuancing and developing, bringing out something that wasn't explicitly mentioned within Proverbs 6. So it's being sensitive to those signs of development and ways in which, where things are positioned in the book, the trajectory on which they're set might serve as a better guide to how we go about preaching something like the sluggard than, okay, I'll pluck it all out and sort of arrange it in whatever way seems to make good sense and go at it that way.
Could you just say something, therefore, about the dangers of looking at the less nuanced, more contrastive statements at the beginning of that section without understanding and seeing how that gets more nuanced as that section goes through?
Yeah, I mean, there is a good example of if we're going to sort of slog through Proverbs 10 to 15, let's say, it just becomes the impression can be this is just pretty basic. When it's not, it is nuanced. And so it's the need to sort of draw into play the nuance within the remainder of the book in order to show, yeah, life isn't this simple. And Proverbs recognizes that life isn't this simple. So also realizing the sort of complex motivational undercurrents that we see within these apparently very simplistic sayings. So even at the beginning of chapter 10, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. Wow, that's revolutionary. But it identifies a very basic human desire, which is, I want to please my mom and dad. Right? I mean, that is sort of the underlying motivation there. It's this observation that's poking that desire to please your parents. To verse 2, ill-gotten treasures have no lasting value, but righteousness delivers from death. Wow, righteousness, enduring value of that character type. But ill-gotten treasures, that means that people have gotten treasures in unjust ways. Oh, it's not that simple. But they just don't have any lasting value. They might have value for people who've exploited others and gotten wealth. There's no lasting value there. Who doesn't want security? That's what Proverbs 10:2 is gesturing to. What will give you security? To verse 3, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Satisfaction. We all want that, right? So even in the apparently simplistic sayings, there are these motivational undercurrents that are there and just ring true. That I think then begin to see, help us to see the depth dimension that is there. That, yes, they appear simplistic, but they're actually appealing to these basic fundamental human desires that I have as a human being to please my parents or to be secure and safe or to be satisfied. And there's also then the nuancing that goes on through the rest of the book. And I think one of our impulses tends to be we read stuff like this and say, it's just so simplistic. It's just common sense stuff. It's maybe too simplistic. But Proverbs recognizes it's not.
So can you give us an example of something simplistic in the first section and then more nuanced on the same theme?
You've just set me up beautifully here. Do we need to take a break? Or can I just take 5 minutes and go after this? Take a break? Okay.
Well, no, up to you. We can
What do we think? Let's do it. Okay. Here, just among the different examples that I've put here on the handout, let me just take a few minutes to do the monarchy. There, Proverbs 16, applying the approach. We'll go all the way down. Bottom of page 4, thematic development, the king, monarchy, in Proverbs 28 to 29. Sound good? Okay, Proverbs 10 to 15. Guess how many times the king is mentioned? Twice. Introduced. Proverbs 10 to 15 is now picking up on all these character types that were introduced in 1 to 9, and it's unpacking them, it's developing them, the wise, the fool, the righteous, the wicked, in a much more comprehensive way. King mentioned twice. Okay. Then we come to Proverbs 16 to 22. We have a host of sayings concerned with the monarchy, fleshing out the nature of the king's rule, his responsibilities within the community, how he is to be really the beacon and the one who establishes justice and righteousness. We get a sort of ethic of leadership that begins to build and is fleshed out through these sayings in 16 to 22, which are much more concerned with the king. Then we come to Proverbs 28 and 29, where we do find a series of sayings where the king is addressed in an idealistic way, being one who establishes justice and righteousness. But now for the first time, we move beyond the idealism. And in Proverbs 28 to 29, the king and the bureaucracy is evaluated very critically. Very critically. And you see it through just some of the sayings there that I've mentioned. Chapter 28, verse 15. Here the king is compared to a roaring lion and a charging bear. He's this ravenous animal who satisfies his irrepressible drives by feeding on the oppressed. He feeds on the marginalized. That same image of a roaring lion is used earlier in Proverbs 19 and in Proverbs 20, where the king is like this roaring lion who inspires awe in order to rein in wicked and disobedient subjects. He uses his power and his authority to establish justice, and now he uses it to feed on the oppressed. Power for personal privilege and gain. And so it goes on in Proverbs 28 and 29. Proverbs 29 verse 4, 28 verse 16. King practices extortion. He accepts kickbacks from lobbyists. He's indifferent to truth. Loves deceptive testimony. And if you read through those sayings that I've mentioned here, it's as if we move from Proverbs 10 to 27, or if you, the king, the government, they're brilliant. They establish justice. There's order and there's harmony, and they care for the rights of others, and they seek to establish and look after the poor. Proverbs 28 and 29 says, yeah, right. And gives us, if you will, the nature of politics as we know it. People who are after power for personal privilege, for self-promotion, to satisfy their own desires. They could give a rip about other people. You see that development there. Two, another that I didn't mention that is there on the handout is even something like wealth and poverty. If all you read was Proverbs 10 to 15, you walk away thinking, wow, all poor people are wicked or lazy or foolish. And then you move into Proverbs 16 to 22 and you begin to realize through all the better than sayings, wow, it's actually better to be poor than a liar. So there are actually poor people who are virtuous out there. Poverty is not simply the product of wickedness or laziness or foolishness. Life's more complicated than that. And Proverbs recognizes that. Just some of the general signs, you can see the movement among the collections in the book. Let's have a break. We'll come back and try to fill in some of these other gaps when we come back.